series and indeed running a conference since 2016. We have the Mediterranean and the maritime realm in the Mediterranean have been challenged by socio-political, economic, and conflict issues, a great number of them in recent years. And that's all true, and Maritime is also deeply involved with them. This webinar is starting to look up a little further to some of the new challenges that are being driven by technology and indeed being driven by nature, as well as by human action. We have a very strong group of people to speak about it together. We have Admiral Fabio Agostini, the commander of EUNAVFOR Mediterranean op Irene. The presentation comes from my boss, Vice Admiral Pete Blount, Royal Navy, commander of Allied Maritime Command. Also, Fotios Moustakis, the director of the Center for Sea Power and Security Studies at Plymouth University, who will be discussing the intersection of security and climate. Mr. Kronos Kapilaitis from the Information Security Forum will be looking at the challenges of cybersecurity at sea. Mr. Pierluigi Barberini from CEI in Rome, looking at the impact of emerging destructive technologies. And Professor Alessio Patalano from King's College London, pulling it all together in a sense, and looking at the wider frame of security and the Mediterranean and how they intersect. So with that, and of course, as you know, you're looking at us on Facebook and YouTube. There's a chat function, and we would welcome your comments, and we would welcome your questions. And those questions are being tabulated for me as the moderator. And as soon as we get to that point, I will be able to address some of those to the speakers. So with that, allow me to pass the floor to Fabio Agostini, the operational commander of Irene and commander EUNAVFOR Mediterranean. Admiral Agostini, it'd be great to hear you again. The floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning to all those that are following this webinar today, and thanks also to Marcom Political Advisor James Bergeron for this introduction. After the previous successful conferences, today we are here for the 8th Road to ShadeMed event that will lead to the ShadeMed conference to be held in October 7 and 8 this year. I'm delighted that NATO Maritime Command organized this webinar and that EUNAVFOR Med Irene and NATO Maritime Command will co-host the ShadeMed conference in October. This is the sign for me that NATO and EU share lots of interests and objectives, in particular in the European southern flank, and especially in the area of the Mediterranean Sea, as they need to intensify cooperation on all levels. EU and NATO have to face new political scenarios and new geopolitical challenges and trends, and I've repeatedly expressed their willingness to work closely together to achieve their common goal, the security and stability of Europe and its neighborhood. They should increase the sharing of information and better coordinate and mutually reinforce the activity at the tactical level in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. Both EUNAVFOR Med Irene and NATO Operation Sea Guardian help the Euro-Atlantic community to significantly enhance the Mediterranean security. But we need to overcome the political stalemate that actually blocks the possibility to cooperate more closely. Today's event and the ShadeMed conference in October would send a valuable sign that we are willing to cooperate closely at the tactical level on future challenges and threats in the Mediterranean Sea. The security of the Mare Nostrum is an essential element for global security. Unfortunately, a great number of the world's crises originated in the Mediterranean basin, and new challenges are not only on the horizon, but are an increasingly obvious reality, as we see in these days. These provide us food for thought about the multiple strategic challenges that will be discussed today. Some distinguished experts are going to explore this issue and ideally make recommendations for future engagement of NATO and the EU, as well as identifying what both organizations can do together. Before leaving the floor, let me thank our speakers who are about to share with us their views on today's topic, new direction in maritime security. And I want also to thank in particular Vice Admiral Blount for accepting to organize this webinar and to kick off today the discussion with his thoughts. I wish everyone an interesting and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
È saltato tutto? È saltato tutto?
Thank you very much, Admiral Costini.
Non ho fatto niente io.
Thank you very much, Admiral Costini. We appreciate those remarks very well, and second your thoughts on the importance of cooperation to address the challenges of the Mediterranean. Let me now turn to Vice Admiral Keith Blount, the commander of Allied Maritime Command. Vice Admiral Blount is a pilot, a helicopter pilot. He has commanded several times at sea. He commanded the HMS Ocean, the amphibious carrier. He was also in charge of the F-35 program and the carrier program for the Royal Navy before he came to MARCOM. But he also has deep roots in maritime security. When he was the deputy commander of Task Force 151 in Bahrain during the era of piracy. So, sir, let me turn to you. For your thoughts.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, everyone, and thank you, Fabio. It's a really great opportunity to be part of the build-up to Shade Med. And as Jim said, I have a background in maritime security. It was around the protection of the oil platforms in the Northern Arabian Gulf when I led the Iraqi Maritime Task Group during Operation Telic, but also and extensively through the era of piracy. And I was very lucky in that I was at one of the very first Shade meetings in the Middle East, probably the second, I think, which was a very small gathering involving good people trying to sort out a wicked challenge of piracy in the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. And from that meeting, the internationally recommended transit corridor was born, and I'm sure most of you will be familiar with that and indeed the success that it brought. But that principle of sharing awareness and deconflicting is so important. And I look to this forum and those that follow through the full Shade Med, of course, to continue to deliver on that theme. I'm very proud to think that NATO is completely on board with that. So in turning to the topic at hand, which is the new directions, the new frontiers of maritime security, it's perhaps important first just to paint a picture of what we do here in NATO's Allied Maritime Command in northwest London. It's interesting. The role of MARCOM is evolving all the time. And I would consider that to be very reassuring, very appropriate, given the shifting sands of maritime security and the shifting nature of the challenges that face us. It's good to think that this headquarters continues to change, adapt, and evolve. And through the adaptation of NATO's command structure, I now have a couple of new titles that I add to the overall title of NATO's Allied Maritime Commander, and they are as the Theatre Component Commander for the maritime domain in NATO, which means I have a very broad responsibility across NATO's area of responsibility to make sure that the collective effort of allied nations is harnessed and delivered in the common interests of the alliance. And my second new title is that of SACEUR's Principal Maritime Advisor. So he has me on speed dial. He phones me up or speaks to me regularly and routinely, asking either for information on how we in the maritime domain are acting or should be acting in the face of current threats and challenges, but also, of course, always with an eye to the future and how we should stay relevant and up to date. It's a busy job. And of course, apart from those titles, I do the day-to-day business of exercising operational control on behalf of SACEUR of the maritime forces that are apportioned to NATO. And they are more varied. It's not just about the standing NATO maritime groups, of which there are 2, of course, or the MCM groups, of which there are 2 also, but also of maritime patrol aircraft that are either acting under our command or in support of what we do here, and submarines, many of them. It's easy to forget that across NATO's alliance, apart from the nuclear submarines that are operated by some nations, we have almost 60 conventional submarines that all need to be looked after and put in the right place at the right time. But NATO's recent history in adapting to maritime security challenges is not just about the adaptation of the command structure. Back in 2011, we had a strategic concept that set out primary mandates of crisis management, for example, as in Afghanistan and Libya, and also cooperative security, where an emphasis and focus was placed on working with non-NATO partners to improve their capabilities for regional peace and security. From that, we had the Alliance Maritime Strategy, also of 2011, which established, in addition to the 3 principal mandates for NATO, a 4th for us here, that of maritime security. It added a real focus on the importance of maritime security that very often concerns issues falling way short of Article 5, for example, and focuses on peacetime activity and operations. Some of you will be familiar with Operation Active Endeavour, which was NATO's response to the 2001 attacks that continued until 2016, until NATO's new operation for maritime security became live, that of Operation Sea Guardian, which remains live today. That focuses on terrorism, international criminal activity at sea, but also on maritime situational awareness and on capacity building. It also, and this is often overlooked, includes other mandates that are dormant unless enacted and approved by the North Atlantic Council to do things such as maritime interdiction operations, the boarding and searching of ships at sea, for example, should they become necessary. Now, Operation Sea Guardian is important because it takes place in the Mediterranean, it takes place alongside other operations such as Irene, and it very much takes place in the same water space. That is why sharing awareness and deconflicting activity is so important. But OSG continues to evolve. We are at the moment reviewing the operational plan that underpins it, looking to exactly what it does and where it does it to make sure it remains contemporary and relevant. But at the moment, it operates across the Mediterranean from west to east and includes a number of activities that are delivered day by day, every day through the year, using units that are either under the command of NATO or in support of NATO in the delivery of that. But it also adds to that focused operations that are punctuated throughout the year that do just as they say. Focus on a particular geographic area, maybe against a particular type of activity, to deliver very concentrated effects over a short period of time. They've been very successful. They are quite popular with nations who like to contribute to them. And of course, they extend and expand on the alliance's overall maritime effect within its area of responsibility. But there are some specific new challenges that now need to be considered and baked in to modern NATO thinking. The first of them is with us all right now, and that is COVID. It's not going away, and while we may consider that we have got through the really hard yards where we lived through a pandemic that was largely almost uncontrollable and delivered death wherever it went, it seems, and created massive challenges in delivering vaccinations and leading to various strategies nationally to limit its spread. We have got through that to a new normal, but it's still tricky. But we in Marcom, as I know the European Union had to do as well, had to adapt very quickly to that spread of the virus while maintaining our ships at sea. And my goodness me, we learned a lot, but we were successful. It proved NATO's ability to be resilient, to be adaptable, and to deal with near-term challenges that required really deep thought and a bit of ingenuity to make sure we did not lose our focus on everyday operations. And I'm proud to say that the activity of all of the four standing groups continued unabated throughout the pandemic and continues unabated now. And there are many here representing their nations as well as maybe institutions that deserve great credit and thanks from me for their role in making sure that was the case. Other challenges, though, are often spoken about, difficult to come to terms with. Cyber would be one. Hybrid warfare would be another. The murkiness of the grey zone that exists at sub-threshold levels, sub-Article 5, but nevertheless is mischievous at best, wicked at its worst, and requires very careful thought and calibration as to how NATO as an alliance adapts to it and deals with it. The climate and its changing nature is an area that will be spoken of more, but that we in NATO Maritime Command are really giving deep thought to. We have great relationships with fine universities such as that of Plymouth, drawing on their academic excellence to assist us in this, while at the same time reaching out to other partners such as the NATO nations that are part of the Arctic Council in understanding the changing nature of, as an example, the North Atlantic, the Northern Sea route, and what that means for resource challenges, the challenges potentially of freedom of navigation, and the improved interconnectivity of the global maritime commons from west to east. What does that mean for new actors that we will see in and around NATO's area of responsibility because of that greater interconnectivity? Now, NATO is not silent in thinking about how to deal with these and indeed making those thoughts public. And I offer you three areas of real importance that wrestle with those challenges and more and drive NATO forward. The first is the concept for deterrence and defence of the Euro-Atlantic area that rethinks the way NATO operates within its AOR to keep it safe and to preserve the peace. The second is NATO's warfighting capstone concept, which is a close relative of the concept for deterrence and defence of the Euro-Atlantic area, owned by Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia, and focusing on where NATO's capability headmarks need to be over the next 20 years or so to ensure that NATO nations procure the right equipment and capabilities to deal with evolving and emerging challenges. And the third is NATO's work around 2030. The NATO 2030 paper, freely available online, brings together under one chapeau document how NATO could consider future challenges, security and otherwise, and how it can bring it in its day-to-day thinking and its day-to-day activities and operations. So NATO is not quiet, NATO is not silent, NATO is determined and resolute to keep pace with the new direction of security challenges, maritime and otherwise, and we very, very much part of that journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Pond. Turning then to those challenges that the Admiral spoke of. The first will be climate. We've seen the striking of Hurricane Ida into Louisiana just in the last 24 hours. There were the floods in Germany, the fires in California and Siberia earlier this year. We are almost becoming used to news about rising tides, rising temperatures. As a political advisor, I've noted that in the last year to two, the debate we had for the last decade about whether or not climate is impacting the planet, whether or not climate is impacting security, has largely been muted. There's been a general acquiescence that we are living in that world. And so we can turn to the question, directly the question, what is the actual impact of climate and climate change on international security, both domestically and internationally? For that, we have with us Dr. Fotios Mistakis, the director of the Center for Sea Power and Security Studies at Plymouth University, who has been a close friend of Marcom. We've worked together on a number of projects over the years. Fotios, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Jim, thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate in this today's webinar. I'm currently in the process to upload some slides, which I believe that will be very helpful in my attempt, of course, to provide you kind of a holistic overview, I would say, of the issue of climate change and its, I would say, implications for maritime security. What I will try to do, actually, in the next couple of minutes, is pretty much first try to address some key facts, in my opinion, some key actions with regards to climate change, and see how climate change affects our security and, of course, maritime security, and as well as EU maritime security. And the last bit of the kind of presentation will concentrate on the Mediterranean, since the Mediterranean it is pretty much the prominent hotspot of kind of climate change effect. So hopefully the presentation will be, be available to view in the next.
We see it.
Excellent. So as I said, that the topic is about the implication of climate change. And let's start with the basic kind of facts. Climate change has become a top priority issue for states and international organizations. And it is true that climate change has evolved from a supposed, I would say, distant problem for future generations to a major imminent security threats for all nations worldwide. And in the 21st century, the nexus between security and the environment has become even more apparent. Interesting enough, I would say, interesting enough, this kind of statement about the nexus between security and the environment was first actually recorded, was actually mentioned in 1996 by the former State Department, in the State Department initiative, and the present initiative by Warren Christopher, actually, to put environmental issues near the top of the American foreign policy agenda. And this actually statement came, as probably some you can recall, from Warren Christopher, a veteran foreign policy maker with a little environmental, I would say, background. So, in my opinion, I think there is a need to deepen the understanding, of course, of the links between climate change and security, and of course, climate change and maritime security. And of course, the other important thing here is, as you can see from this kind of apocalyptic photo from the recent forest fires that took place actually in the East Med in Greece, in this case, as well, of course, as in Italy and also Turkey. The truth is climate change is happening, and it's happening actually now. And that is a kind of a fact. We do understand, and we do accept the fact that, the impact, as I said, is not always visible. And that's why most of global environmental crises, I would say, have uneven effects and involvement. And I think this is one of the challenges that we face these days, where to convince key global players to actually place this issue, the threat of climate change, as one of the top priorities. However, also, it is also important also to stress here how climate change can affect, of course, militaries. Militaries will be increasingly overstretched as climate change intensifies. Right. And as the pace and intensity of extreme weather events increases, countries are increasing their reliance on military forces as first responders. And direct climate change effects will threaten military installation, will threaten military infrastructure, and of course will threaten, of course, to reduce the military readiness. So if I can just, turn now to my attention a little bit to the European Union maritime interest. It's also well documented, in the EU maritime security kind of strategy document, how the EU actually understands maritime security by stating its kind of interests, threats, and rights. For the European Union, of course, the maritime interests are vital for the protection, of the EU citizens' infrastructure activities. Approximately 40% of the EU population lives in coastal regions. Of course, vital because of its external coastal borders and control of the maritime external borders, but also, it is vital, with regard to sustainability and prevention of illegal reporting and unregulated fishing. Let's not, of course, forget, that for the EU, it's also important, of course, the maritime interests, because we will try, of course, to prevent conflicts and bring about stability and rule of law. And of course, all this, let's not forget, 90% of international trade is, of course, taking place, is through maritime routes. But also for the EU, of course, ensuring global supply chain safety and freedom of navigation, it is vital. And let's not forget, with regard to the European Union, 30% of the world vessels and 42% of value of seaboard trade are managed by ship owners, from the European Union. So it's not a surprise that, for the European Union, of course, maritime security matters, because it has to deal with a number of specific significant threats. Transnational security threats, from proliferation of weapons, piracy and terrorism, to organized crime, and illegal trafficking, but also territorial disputes and armed conflicts. The interesting thing here is, of course, and the interesting point I want to make here is that climate change will also challenges. That will bring about challenges for the law of the sea, which I will mention in the next couple of slides. But in my opinion, the mother of all threats, of course, is natural disasters and climate change. Climate change, of course, is the mother of all threats because of its impact on environment, the adverse risks and effects, of course, of social impact that will have. And as one professor, Professor Norman Myers, one of the world leading experts on environment, mentioned in the 1996, he called this as the ultimate security problem. For Norman Myers, no civilization is responsible for environmental conditions that limit or enlarge its development options. So it is constitutes an ultimate security problem. But climate change, when we're talking about climate change and mother of all threats, what do we mean? We can see the impact of climate change with the temperature rise, with the sea level rise, with the increased frequency of weather events, extreme weather events. We'll see, of course, changes, humidity and air quality, the acidification of the sea, wave storms, stormy meteorological tides from heat waves, floods, and droughts. Think about it. Over the last couple of months, pretty much we witnessed all these phenomena, and it's not a surprise as a result, of course, of our kind of human action. But also climate change will also have, as I mentioned, significant environmental impact. And some of these, the impacts of on the environment, this is just an indicative list, not an exhaustive list, is actually refers to the high rate of coastal erosion, to unwanted entry of salt water into the habitats of lagoon and estuaries, to pollutions that we will, of course, or drainage of coastal wetlands. We will have floods, of coastal areas, and of course, significant changes, not only biodiversity, but also in the structure of fishing grounds. And as I mentioned, environmental, of course, impact will have a significant also social impact, and will challenge the resources of the nation states in an attempt to address it. And that some of these, impacts can be also identified as the destruction of the infrastructure, roads, coastal, technical works, to the damage to coastal tourist information and tourism, which represents for many countries, especially the Mediterranean, I would say, a vital source of income, to reduction or elimination of ecotourism, infrastructure and activities, and of course, let's not forget climate migration, as well as the loss of cultural identity, loss of resources, and of course, most importantly, of course, with regard to kind of the security issue and related issue, population movements. So it is not then a surprise that, in my opinion, climate change represents these days the ultimate security problem, as it was mentioned by Norman Myers, because it will challenge it. It will probably bring about challenges to human security. It will probably lead to conflicts between states over, of course, for example, exploitation of drinking water. And of course, the management of climate migration flows will represent a significant challenge for organizations and nation states. And ultimately, when we talk about the issue of this ultimate security problem, in my opinion, it's not a problem of humankind's struggle with nature, but a problem of humankind's struggle with the dynamics of its own cultures. Ultimately, the Earth will survive whether or not humanity does. Even the non-human living population could survive almost everything, except, of course, a nuclear winter. The security problem is for human civilization. And now, let's give you some kind of examples of the impact of climate change on maritime security, which of course can affect EU, of course, and NATO. As I mentioned earlier on, a possible impact of climate change on the, will be on the level of the sea. As a result of the rising sea levels and erosion, we will probably witness the possible change of coastal state baselines. And as we know, the maritime claims of a coastal, states with respect to the coastal zones and exclusive economic zones, the continental shelf, are determined by the baselines. So any possible change, the current delimitation of maritime zones, might lead to the loss of maritime rights and valuable resources in maritime zones. And of course, it's not an understatement to mention that specific, for example, change as a result of the impact of climate change will lead to new disputes and conflict between states. Another kind of example, as I said, we can really elaborate, in depth about this, but I hope I can provide you some kind of a holistic overview. Another possible kind of impact that climate change can affect, maritime security and Navy operations has to do, of course, especially at the submarine warfare, as a result of the climate change implication, is with the increasing temperature, which will warm the upper waters. You will have the increased speed of the sound and, of course, salinity. That can cause changes in transmission loss and detection level, and as a result, it will affect, weapons such as torpedoes or acoustic sensors. So you can see also how that specific kind of event, climate change, can also impact on kind of Navy operations. Furthermore, also possible impact of climate change also on aviation. That is actually a photograph of the Karpathos island, the airport from Karpathos Island in the Med. Rising sea level storm surges will definitely threaten coastal airports. Warmer air might pose, of course, takeoff weight restrictions, while wind patterns, shifting wind patterns will modify, the optimal flight routes, and it will have a significant effect, of course, on fuel consumption. And let's not forget that the extreme weather will cause, of course, disruption and delays, and affects, of course, the traffic, of course, in the case, of these islands, of the coastal airports. But also, one other issue which probably we don't really pay much of attention is also the potential impact of climate change on underwater heritage. Underwater heritage represents our culture. It is part of our culture. It's part of our national identity and our history of the states. So what about that underwater heritage, and the sunken World War I and II naval vessels? Let's not forget that most of this, as a result of the climate change, most of these ships will be basically made of rustic metals. And of course, that can cause, changes, the chemical changes, in the sea. Chemical changes in the sea can become more hotter, more acidic. Of course, as a result of this, will lead to the deterioration of the shipwrecks. And as a result of that, to the loss of cultural heritage and possible environmental disaster. So we can see there are a number of examples which will affect, of course, maritime security and maritime security interest. Now, the interesting, of course, case here, of course, is the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean basin, based on a scientific assessment report by a number of scientists, by more than 80 scientists from 23 countries, they raised the alarm about the impact of climate change on the Mediterranean region. The Mediterranean region, they said, they argue, is warming 20% faster than the global average. And they expect that, the regional temperature will increase of more than 2.2 per Celsius. That specific kind of fact will definitely have serious repercussions on the region and, of course, on the attempt by the nation states in the Mediterranean on a number of areas, like food security. Food demand is said to increase, or water resources. With, of course, within 20 years, they expect that 250 million people will be classified as water poor. And of course, let's not forget that also its impact that the climate change will have also on the health and security of these countries, because as we witness, and have witnessed personally, actually, unfortunately, the frequency, intensity, and duration of heat waves in the East Med definitely will cause more significant health risks, and of course, especially for vulnerable populations in urban areas, but also increased frequency in droughts. So that can also will definitely challenge the ability of the state to respond to these threats. And of course, as we mentioned before, of course, the Mediterranean region is unfortunately one of the most prominent hotspots of climate and environmental kind of change. And the number of mega fires that we witnessed this summer, unfortunately, will definitely cause significant, damage to the infrastructure of the state and of the states. And it's interesting that a lot of people actually consider things that climate change is forcing, unfortunately, the Mediterranean landscape into a flammable state by drying out vegetation and priming it actually to burn. So all this as a result of climate change. But let's not forget all these challenges and kind of that identify also interact with also other environmental changes like pollution and urban growth. And that, of course, if we take all this into consideration, we can understand the kind of challenge that we face, and hence in order, of course, to address these issues. So what basically we can do about it? I mean, the truth is that climate change will have a massive impact on defense and our security, and will serve as a threat multiplier and imposing pressure on our resources as states and as organizations. There is no doubt in my mind that a holistic approach is needed must be embraced and adopted. Only a holistic approach can actually address these issues. And when, of course, we talk about a holistic approach, we are talking mainly about make sure that there is a joint effort, cooperation, communication, and public outreach, but also the issue of co-perception. As I say in Greece, syneidesis, conscience, that this actually problem will affect our security. But also, importantly, I think, it is worth mentioning here the role of the military and the military open science. The military science can play to help governments to address some of these threats. We should not underestimate the role of the military and the military science, which can help towards this direction. Ultimately, I think we are running out of time. I mean, the former American President Barack Obama used to say that we are, the first generation to feel the impact of climate change, but we are probably the last generation that can do something about it. So we need to promote synergies so we can prevent conflicts and instability. And ultimately, I think it is our task, I would say, to raise the awareness, educate people, and train, the future practitioners, the leaders of tomorrow, because the new generation of decision makers will be the one, of course, that will have to continue with specific action in attempt to address this kind of threat. So that's all what I want to say. I hope I didn't take more than I should, Jim, and if I did, please apologize. Thank you for the invitation, and I'll be more than happy to address this, any questions you might have after the other presentations.
Thanks very much, Fotios. That's an absolutely fascinating presentation. I think you have your mic on. Or it's us. Anyway, okay, good. I think we're good now. Thank you. That was really interesting, and the information on the increased rise of temperature in the Mediterranean by 2040, I did not know that. One of the problems of listening to the COP26 debates is that we talk about the global rise of temperature, not the regional rise of temperature. From a security point of view, the regional rise of temperature matters a great deal. And I think your comments will have sparked a lot of questions amongst the listeners out there, so, which we'll come to in the Q&A session. Admiral Blount spoke of one of a human being's first security concerns is the relationship with their own body. On a day-to-day basis, the average person's security, health and physical security is based upon their own biosystem and what might attack it. You've raised probably the second most common security issue for the average person, which is the weather and its extreme nature in recent years. Facetiously, one might say that the average person's third most greatest perceived sense of insecurity is when their internet server goes out or somebody hacks their phone in the modern world. So on that point, of course, what I'm trying to get at, of course, is the rise of the cyber world of information technology, of which we are all a part, and the risk that presents, particularly at sea. And to discuss that, we have a great expert on this, Chronis Kapolaitis, former commander of the Greek Navy, commander in the Greek Navy, didn't mean to promote you, and principal at the Information Security Forum and at Warwick University. Chronis, please, the floor is yours to address the cyber question.
Thanks so much, Jim, and thank you for the very kind invitation. Let me try and share my screen before I start. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Before I start, I would like to go back 13 years in history, back in December 2008, when I was an officer, a Navy officer, at HMS Psara, a Greek frigate, which was the first flagship of the first ever EU naval mission, Operation Atalanta in Somalia. And we were the flagship And as part of my roles there as an operations officer, I was also the Chief Information Security Officer. And it was back then when we started looking at cybersecurity and cyber hygiene. So we were actually starting to explore, are we allowed to use USB sticks? What can be the stake of a cyber breach on board a vessel? Will we be losing communications with our headquarters in Northwood back then? So 30 years later, fast forward, I'm sitting here with you today, and it's really an honor for me to have the Admiral both from the EU mission in the mission Irini, and also the Admiral from NATO Markham, and sharing what I have learned throughout my journey over these years. So I am sitting here today representing the Information Security Forum. And very briefly, for those of you who don't know us, the Information Security Forum is a non-for-profit organization. It's an independent global organization which focuses on sharing information, content, capability, and community, as you see there at the bottom, regarding information security, cybersecurity, and risk management. We are producing reports and research. We transform them into actual tools, actionable items that you can take and use, and we also facilitate discussion between our members. We're a members-based organization, more than 450 organizations around the globe in light of Microsoft, Barclays, and other large entities, several of which are from the maritime sector as well. So to start my presentation, and because in the previous session we looked at how environmental threats have occurred over the last month or so, by sharing this slide, this shows us some of the most prominent maritime-related cyber incidents that have occurred. And if we take out Maersk, which happened in June 2017, so 4 years ago now, the rest of them happened more or less in the last 12 to 18 months. So we have seen large maritime shipping companies, we have seen the IMO actually being affected, and we're seeing a lot of ports throughout the globe being affected by cyber incidents, and that affects their daily operations. So a business interruption event on the commercial side of things can actually escalate, as we've seen on the Ever Given event, which was probably not cyber related, but it can escalate and have implications on the overall maritime security awareness from the Navy side of things. But in order to try and clarify what are the actual threats in the cyber domain that we are facing, we can look at two main categories. So the first one, which is explained here, has to do with interruption of the signals that a vessel requires in order to navigate safely. Obviously, we can do navigation through bearings and distances, terrestrial navigation, but nowadays, using GPS to navigate our ships, even though as a Navy officer, I'm not a big advocate of that, but that's a different discussion, we rely a lot on GPS. So one way of interrupting ships in the cyber domain is through interfering with the GPS signal that they're receiving for the safety of navigation. And the second one that we will see in a bit is actually interfering with the systems on board the ship in order to influence and jeopardize their navigation. So on the slide here, you can see some articles that were published last year, and I was part of that research, which looks at the different implications of GPS jamming and GPS spoofing, either not receiving GPS signal or receiving tampered GPS signal. Also, there were further research conducted to identify what these problems are, but recently, a book was published where I have contributed with a chapter on cybersecurity at sea, which touches upon the element of GPS interference. But this is something that both the EU, NATO, and other navies have identified over the years. And you can see in these two graphs, the one at the top right, where it says areas with GPS interference, was actually produced by NATO Markham. And it identifies areas in the Eastern Mediterranean where we had interference regarding the GPS. And the bottom left graph with the statistics, you can see, which is generated from the Department of Homeland Security in the US, calls out specific incidents in 2018 and 2019 that have occurred again in the same region. And this is just an example to illustrate that reports have come to Navy, to the navies, but also to international organizations about GPS interference. So how do we deal with that? What are the navies doing? What's the Navy's response to that? So here you can see as an example how the US Maritime Administration dealt with it initially in 2017 by issuing an advisory for Black Sea GPS-related interference. In 2018, that was updated and it touched upon the Eastern Mediterranean GPS interference, but also at the top right, NATO MARCOM requested seafarers operating in the Eastern Mediterranean to report any GPS interference that they occurred. So the Navy is very interested in understanding this new threat and trying to come up with solutions to address that. And I can tell you, coming from a Navy background, we have been in a position to deal with this threat over time pretty effectively, I could say. But moving on to the second part, the second type of interference that we can deal with in our operations at sea, and those are targeting systems on board ships. 2 years ago, the US Coast Guard issued an advisory which illustrated, and this takes down a lot the myth that the ships are not vulnerable while at sea. The advisory specifically talks about malware, and this is malicious software that has been developed to disrupt seaboard computer systems specifically. So threat actors out there have developed specific tools and specific ways of penetrating and causing damage to systems on board ships. And recently, there was also another report that was leaked which identifies the research conducted to look at specific vulnerabilities on board ships. And this specific report looked at ballast water management issues and how they could be tampered in the cyber realm, but also specific communication equipment that could be affected in order to manipulate and jeopardize the safety of navigation at sea. Of course, there has been research done on this, and this is a research project that I was engaged in that was launched and published by Chatham House, a think tank based in London, a few years ago, where we have identified the vulnerabilities, consequences, and the affected fields of an incident on board the vessel. So there is literature out there that can support both the military side of navigation, but also the commercial navigation and commercial ships in order to assist them to prepare and be ready to respond and address those risks. And I would like to finish this session by showing you this specific graph, which shows the dots that you see there all around in circle is actually AIS transmitted position of ships at shore while they should be at sea. And for those of you who are familiar with the GPS architecture, it's very difficult to cause this interference by tampering with the GPS signal that is received from the satellite. So this is something that was generated from the ground, something that was generated probably from the center of the circle that we see. So having this image and looking at ships at shore while they should be at sea could also tamper a lot and cause great disruption in the safety of navigation at sea. And with that, I would like to thank you. And as previously mentioned, I'm at your disposal for any further questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kronis. That was really excellent. A very good presentation on this issue. Of course, Marcom is deeply focused on the issue. As you say, the examples of GPS spoofing 2 years ago, a bit of a strange thing, are becoming almost normal now. More and more navies report that their ships, AIS world is seeing their ships, inside somebody's territorial waters, where the ship's actually in their own home port. So this is increasingly a difficulty and a challenge, and I'm sure that will also be of interest to those who are tuning in, and we may hear some thoughts from them on that subject. Turning now towards the world of technology. we are very pleased to have with us Pierluigi Barberini from CESI in Rome, who has done some good research on this. I've read your work. I'm really looking forward to hearing your discussion on some of the technological challenges to the military balance and to regional peace and stability. So, Pierluigi, it's over to you.
Thank you for inviting me, for inviting Chesi to this very interesting conference today. I'm going to talk briefly about the military competition in the Mediterranean Sea and the impact on the security of the region, specifically with a focus on the electromagnetic spectrum, EMS, which is also something related to what Mr. Kapalidis just said. So as we know, since several years, an intense geopolitical military confrontation is in progress in the Mediterranean region. And one of the dimensions of this confrontation is related to the electromagnetic spectrum. On the one hand, we have geopolitical military tensions. We have the proliferation of several military vessels patrolling the water, the Mediterranean Sea, especially Central and Eastern Mediterranean, with an intense electromagnetic activity. We have military operations carried out in conflict zones, such as in Syria or in Libya. And all of these result in a challenging and contested electromagnetic environment in the region, and also mutual forms of interferences in the electromagnetic spectrum are expected. On the other hand, at the military level, we have state actors involved in a process of acquiring new capabilities to specifically operate in this sector. For instance, Algeria, which purchased some electronic warfare system by Russia. So in this general context, we have the maritime domain, both on the military side and on the civilian and commercial side, that is highly dependent on EMS-based services. For instance, just think about navigation, communication, and positioning. And in this sense, we have new threats that are emerging from all the forms of electronic warfare, which are also related to cyber warfare in some forms. I would like just to mention a few new threats. We have navigation warfare, we have space electronic warfare, and we have cyber electronic warfare. Navigation warfare is the detection, denial, deception of the position, navigation, timing systems. And as we know, for instance, nowadays, global navigation satellite systems such as GPS or the European Galileo play a crucial role for both military actors as well as for civilian and commercial actors. And they are extremely important for commercial civilian operations as well. In the Mediterranean region, we have some adversary forces that try to jeopardize, to disrupt the conduct of operations by other actors by using advanced jamming, spoofing technologies. GPS spoofing, we just talked about that, could be considered a form of navigation warfare, actually. Then we have space electronic warfare. Satellite systems, satellite applications are very important nowadays, and they can be disrupted by recurring to kinetic actions, but also by using electronic warfare and cyber warfare means. And electronic warfare, cyber warfare may be the most preferred way, actually, to attack space capabilities, because they are easier and cheaper to carry out by malicious actors, because they actually cannot be tracked without specific dedicated monitoring systems. And so this is also an important threat emerging in the region. And then we have cyber electronic warfare. Just to say that we used to think to cyber warfare, electronic warfare as two independent spheres. But nowadays, the boundaries between the two fields have begun to blur. The United States armed forces are studying new ways to blend electronic warfare with cyber capabilities. And nowadays, cyber warriors can attack spectrum capabilities, and spectrum warriors can engage in order to create effects in the cyber domain as well. So this is to say, in other words, that the electromagnetic spectrum is becoming a sort of entry point, entryway for cyber actors as well, and that we need to start to think to the two spheres, cyber warfare, electronic warfare, as two sides of the same coin. So what are the impacts of these new technological threats specifically related to the electromagnetic spectrum in the Mediterranean region? As I said, there is an intense geopolitical military activity and geopolitical tensions in the Mediterranean region, and these tensions have translated into a highly volatile cyber threat environment, as well as a highly contested and congested electromagnetic environment, where states operating in the region using electronic warfare techniques and systems in order to impede their adversaries' ability to communicate, to navigate, to exchange information at sea. And this also has an impact on commercial vessels, because commercial civilian vessels have been caught in this sort of crossfire, electronic crossfire between states actors in the region. We have GNSS interferences, we have maritime radar systems that may be denied by these activities. Just to make an example, as we all know, since the beginning of its military intervention in Syria in 2015, Russia has deployed some of its most advanced electronic warfare systems, such as the Krasuka-4. It is a system, very briefly, that can neutralize low Earth orbits by satellites, as well as airborne surveillance radars. So Russia is able to counter reconnaissance satellites, drones, or planes by, for instance, NATO member states in the area. And so this system can be programmed in order to engage and to deny or disrupt NATO ISR activities in the region, NATO intelligence gathering activities in the region. And it is a crucial component of the overall anti-access area denial bubble built by Russia over Syria. So as Moscow tries to increase its influence in the region, it uses electronic warfare systems, methods, techniques, such as GNSS interferences, in order to prevent adversaries from interfering with military operations in Syria, in order to protect its forces deployed on the battlefield in Syria. And such an intense electromagnetic activity is also a huge impact, both in terms of the conduct of military operations by other states, other actors in the region, as well as for the overall security context for also commercial or civilian vessels in the waters of the Mediterranean region. In 2018, General Raymond Thomas, commander of the United States Special Operations Command, said that Syria has become the most aggressive and intense electronic warfare environment in the world, on the planet. So this is just to say how intense such type of activity is in the region. And as Professor Mr. Kapalidis said before, we have GNSS interferences that have been reported off the coast of Syria, but also south of Cyprus up to the coast of Lebanon, near Turkey, near Port Said in Egypt, and also in Libya, off the coast of Libya as well. So in general, near zones where military operations are carried out, near conflict zones. So I conclude, we have to consider that old and new forms of electronic warfare are now a significant threat to the conduct of both military operations in the Mediterranean region and also to the operations of civilian and commercial vessels, to maritime shipping in the region. A key element is that the electromagnetic spectrum has this twofold dimension, the military side and the civilian side. As we know, maritime shipping, maritime economy, the global economy is highly dependent on satellite services, in general on EMS-based services based on the functioning of this spectrum. And so this poses new challenges for all the actors involved in the maritime domain, and all these challenges need to be taken into account. We have in the Mediterranean region, we have adversaries that are trying to use more sophisticated electronic warfare techniques in order to disrupt each other's operation in the region. We have also the possibility that some state actors could target civilian vessels flagged from their rivals with electronic warfare activity. So I conclude by saying that we need maybe to start to think to the electromagnetic spectrum, since we have all these threats, new threats emerging in this field, to a sort of critical infrastructure like pipelines or underwater cables that must be protected in certain ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierluigi. That was a fascinating conversation, fascinating discussion of this issue, which of course we are also significantly focused on. I was struck in your comments by the change in our paradigm when we think about maritime security. Those of us who are old enough to remember it, in the noughties and in the early teens, when we talked about maritime security threats, it was almost totally through a paradigm of private actors, pirates, insurgents, international organized crime. Increasingly, in the latter teens and now into the early 20s of the century, we are seeing a mix of challenges which are coming from private actors, but also from states and from their proxies. So it's a much more complex mix now than it was before. I think you raised a second good point, because the types of capabilities that we now need to grasp, for instance, the electromagnetic spectrum and cyber, are outside of traditional military domains. They're certainly not controlled by military organizations or departments of defense, meaning that we need new models for command and control of all domain operations. With that, let me turn to our final speaker, final presentation of the webinar, Alessio Patalano from King's College London. And may I be the first to congratulate you, Professor Patalano, because I know this is your first public engagement after you're receiving both your professorship and your chair as Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia at King's College London. Congratulations. And let me then turn it to you to provide a holistic overview of what you've heard and your perspectives on Mediterranean and maritime security in the midst of all these new challenges.
Jim, thank you very much for the kind invitation and opportunity to celebrate in a practical and hopefully useful way the recent promotion. Vice Admiral Blount, Rear Admiral Agostini, thank you very much for creating the opportunity to have this conversation. And if I may, I'd like to really start my remarks by building upon comments that in a way you both made, and to me speak to one of the three elements, the three sort of points that I'd like to make in my remarks today, what I call closing the three gaps in maritime security. First of all, it seems to me that, as Admiral Bland was saying, maritime security is constantly shifting, requires a lot of adaptability. And there's three gaps, I think, that are important to consider as we try to discuss how to set the agenda for the pathway ahead of us in understanding, studying, and indeed tackling maritime security issues. The first is how to close the regional global nexus in setting the order of security priorities in the realm of maritime affairs. And I'll come back to this point in a minute. So the second gap that I want to talk about is closing the gap of different meanings of maritime security. It was very interesting when Admiral Bland was talking about that he started looking at maritime security when it was about protecting and securing oil platforms, and then operationally came back to it when it was a lot more about piracy, as also Jim was mentioning. And I think today we need to sort of start re-engaging with the notion of what does maritime security means to different actors within the maritime domain, both navies and state actors, because there is a tremendous variety of differences in both vocabulary and the meaning of the grammar of maritime security. And again, this speaks to the first point about that regional global nexus that again needs to be sort of talked about. And the third one was a point that Rear Admiral Agustin was mentioning, and that is closing the interoperability gap, sharing information, developing mechanisms that allow us to share our resources better. And again, NATO here has a long-standing knowledge of the challenges and the opportunities that this has, and perhaps a stronger conversation with NATO taking the lead on it, with other international actors, whether this the European Union or indeed the partners outside the immediate sort of European region, that is the Mediterranean region. I think that is part of their consideration. So 3 gap: closing the regional global nexus, closing the, if you want, the maritime security understanding gap, and closing the interoperability gap, that is the practical manifestation. Now, why do I talk about that structural regional element? Because and today the conversation has been absolutely fantastic, because it has brought this tension quite center stage. If we're talking about international affairs, the structural dimension of international affairs, where international order or power balance are concerned, the matter of the Sino-American competition and the geopolitical tensions unfolding from the sort of competition between the United States-led international order as we know it today, compared sort of in opposition to the authoritarian regimes like China, like Russia, that are set against it in many respects. And it was very interesting that just yesterday, the national security strategy, the new national security strategy in Russia was released. And like in China, there is an absolutely binary presentation of the world that is divided between us and those who are against us. And those who are against us are led by the United States. And so there is that structural element that one needs to sort of integrate into conversation about regional security. And that obviously does not leave the Mediterranean out of it. Just a few sort of elements of notice here, with linking with some of the elements discussed in the presentations earlier on today, whether it is Russia, China, military cooperation, with exercises and other type of activities taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean and other parts of the Euro-Atlantic region, whether it is about growing ties between China itself and actors that are relevant to the broader or the enlarged Mediterranean region. I think here about the recent new agreements between Iran and China that seem to have politically cemented the relationship now, looking at 25 years of investment in each other, with the Iranians commenting that China is a friend in the hard times. And I'll leave it to you to sort of interpret with that, how far that goes. To the broader sort of geo-economic initiatives pertaining to the Belt and Road Initiative, that go to well into the Mediterranean, with Chinese state-owned enterprises becoming increasingly involved in more than a dozen ports and a considerable amount of shipping activities, which in turn raises a crucial question about other forms of what Admiral Bland was talking about, sub-threshold activities, access to port facilities. If we look at what the Chinese have done in other parts of the world, most notably in the East and the South China Sea, obviously access does not translate into military installations right away, but it certainly opens the door for increased activity, particularly in this new domain like cyber, electronic warfare, as a way to enhance that. And that is on top of what we already know of Russian activities, whether it is the Mediterranean, the sort of the Gulf state region, or indeed the broader sort of Euro-Atlantic area. So that structural element of the story needs to be brought back into, I think, our conversation about moving ahead and sort of teasing out how it links to the existing understandings of maritime security. But if that is the structural picture at the regional level, the order of priorities is very different, as we've heard today. At the regional level, it's not so much international order and power balance that matters. It's very much political, social, and economic stability, and how these problems, these challenges relate to the maritime domain. And here, three themes, I think, are coming out very strongly, and that are likely to remain center stage in main sort of Mediterranean-focused conversation. Migration, terrorism, and crime at sea, and how it relates to activities on land, and of course, climate change, which Professor Moustakis talked about so eloquently and passionately earlier on today. Now, I'm very lucky and fortunate because I don't have to go too much into details for covering these three aspects, but I will highlight 3 points. Insofar as migration is concerned, if we look at the case of one of the key aspects, one of the sort of political crises that remains and sources of political instability, which in turn has been sort of taking a center stage in issues on migrations across the Mediterranean, is of course the continued situation both in Libya and Syria, which have represented sources of migration and sort of flow of people from this difficult areas and then across the Mediterranean through Europe. It's interesting that, particularly in the context of the European Union, since the Malta Declaration of 2017 down to Operation Irene, there has been considerable steps. And I think what is really important here to emphasize is the role that within maritime security, maritime naval forces can have on capacity building, protection of those who are stranded at sea, as well as contributed to enhance sort of border security control and management. And assuming that sort of set of understanding and sort of priorities remains in dealing with terrorism and crime at sea, in which improving information sharing, again, border control, assistance in capacity building, as well as a greater level of interoperability, whether it is in information sharing, whether it is in coordinating and deconflicting resources distributed. I think these are all themes that have been discussed at length and remain very sort of central. Insofar as the climate change question is concerned, I would probably only suggest sort of a small caveat. I think climate change is sort of part of the broader conversation about risks rather than threats. Threats tend to be sort of a fire that is taking place is a threat, a missile coming at you is a threat. The problems unfolding from movement of people as a result of sea level rises or desertification of land. These are sort of challenges and risks that need to be tackled, that need to be sort of prevented, and if and when they occur, managed. And so in this respect, I would say one interesting point to make in terms of the maritime security question, again, information sharing about understanding where the problems are and where these events are taking place and start to build patterns in terms of being able to foresee if, when, and where they could take place. Secondly, creating the structural mechanisms or enhance the current structural mechanism, which we've seen some of taking place during the summer as the fires started to spread across Europe in terms of response, and then of course management as in what happens in the aftermath. And as I said, I couldn't support more the points that Professor Moustakis was making about the absolutely central state, the center stage that climate change will have. And again, here navies and maritime forces tend to have as a general sort of approach climate change as something in which they can do something about, when they focus on the 2P aspect, as a polluter or as a provider. And so navies tend to emphasize their contribution in reducing the polluting activities, so by making ships greener, by adopting practices and standards that favor that. But at the same time, I think there is a very important conversation about what is the role of maritime forces in a broader sense, about the element of as providers in support of information gathering, prevention and management of the broader consequences of climate change. And again, I echo here Professor Mustaki's point about the importance of understanding patterns in extreme weather events as a way to better correlate it to issues of migration, potential crime, as well as conflict in areas that are relevant to the Mediterranean. So what are my suggestions and recommendations as we move promptly into the conversation space of this webinar? I have three sort of recommendations that are going to try to address these issues of closing the structural, if you want, the regional gap, and closing the maritime security understanding gap, and sort of closing the, if you want, interoperability gap. The first point is we're very good, and this webinar has proved that, because every single speaker so far has presented an absolutely crystal clear, very in-depth picture of what is happening inside the Mediterranean in relation to specific themes. However, what we're not as good at is placing the Mediterranean experience in the broader shifts in international relations at the structural level, which prompts the question of sort of engaging. Where does the Mediterranean region end? Where does it begin? And how it correlates to adjacent areas. We cannot talk about the enlarged Mediterranean in particular and sort of focus on Middle East and Gulf states region from a maritime perspective without engaging in conversation about how the Gulf state region links to the Western Indian Ocean region, and from there to the broader Indo-Pacific questions that are dominating the agenda, certainly in Washington, DC. And so in part of that, we need to sort of start in setting this new agenda. I think we need to start thinking about how to better position the relationship between those structural factor in relation to the regional stability priority. And within that context, trying to sort of start flesh out the links that Jim was mentioning earlier on in terms of the sub-threshold activities and how they intersect, they interact with problems of stability and order, most notably insofar as Libya and Syria are concerned, and then right after that, Gulf state security and sort of Iranian activities in that part of the world. And as a possible suggestion here, I would say looking at specific partners that outside of Europe have strong links in Europe, but share at the same time an understanding of both the structural issues, and they are concerned in their own region about stability questions as we are in the Mediterranean. I think that's a good starting point. Within this context, no actor can come to mind like Japan, which has been developing very strong ties with both the European Union, some of the key member states within the European Union, as well as with NATO over the last decade, particularly in the Western Indian Ocean, Gulf region. So starting to thinking about how to place the Mediterranean experience and security landscape into that broader spectrum, I think is number one sort of way to start addressing this gap between the structural and regional differences in security priorities when it comes to maritime domain. Second, and this is more about the second element of the story, that sort of the different meanings of maritime security, closing that gap. I think in European and Mediterranean conversations, matters and issues of political, social, economic stability, climate change, and they are absolutely central, and rightfully so. But at the same time, we cannot forget that there is a genuine shift at the structural level towards state-on-state competition that has implication for capabilities, as well as how we conduct operation. And at the moment, there seems in the Mediterranean region, very few actors have taken that on stock. And of course, it's not just about navies, it's about also a shared political understanding of how international politics are developing. But I was very pleased when Admiral Blount mentioned the fact that NATO war-fighting capstone document and deterrence and defense documents are being sort of re-engineered to fit the purpose of current international state of affairs. And I think a conversation between NATO and the European Union, and again, actors within the broader Mediterranean on these matters is absolutely long overdue, with taking into consideration the importance of military activities and not just predominantly the constabulary side of the equation. Which leads to the last point, and really this matter of closing the interoperability gap. If anything, all we've discussed today raises a very important challenge, but also in that sense, I'm a positive person. I'm a guy from the Mediterranean, so I can only put positive spin on things. I'm genetically designed to be positive. And I think what is creating is an opportunity for naval diplomacy, dare I say, to actually being sort of taken out of the small little corners it had been confined in the past intellectually, and become fully embedded into all activities that we conduct. In particularly, and when it comes to maritime security, in the constabulary realm, we know that HADR is a real possibility. We know that climate change may demand sometime in the future maritime forces to be deployed in some form of operation. So we need to start thinking. We will not know when these events will occur, but we know that they will, because the science data tell us so. And so thinking about these constabulary activities and linking them in terms of their potential political value, whether it is to build a new relationship, consolidate political stability, or indeed empower us with better knowledge of our adversaries and how they do. I think it's something that is more sort of structurally integrated in our grammar on how we approach maritime security. And certainly in this respect, when it comes to the Mediterranean, sort of prompting a stronger conversation on that interoperability piece that starts with information sharing, but I think it also needs to lead to a much stronger direction in terms of sharing capabilities, resources, and creating the context for that. So all of this, I think, is the first steps to transform what has been known for a long time as the Mare Nostrum, although that Nostrum changed over time, to a Mare Omnium, one in which all actors within the Mediterranean region can feel that are partaking to a process that leads to stability, hopefully, and that certainly will contribute to maintain a structural order and a stable power balance to avoid greater troubles to happen in the near future. On this note, I'll stop here. Thank you very much and look forward to the questions. Over.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alessia. A very masterful sum up of many of our issues, and indeed going beyond summary to some remarkably good recommendations that I think that chime with all of us. That concludes the kind of the formal presentation bit, but we have some time for questions and answers and some discussion. We have a few questions from the listeners who've been tuning in, and I think there are some amongst the speakers as well. Admiral Blount, do you have anything in particular you'd like to ask?
I mean, it's not so much a question, but it's an observation, really, on things that have been said that have been really quite exceptional, because we have ranged across the complete tapestry, I would suggest, of maritime security challenges in a contemporary setting. And you know, and I congratulate each of the individual speakers for kind of maintaining clear water between their various areas of speaking today. But I suppose I can frame this as a question to all of those listening, because when you get a maritime security gathering such as this, and of course we've all been to many of them, classically, there is an academic dimension to it, there is a military dimension to it, but less commonly is the political dimension. And it is the political dimension that hold many of the keys, because many of the security challenges we've spoken about today militarily are simple to address. It's not that we don't necessarily have the right capability or the right military will or the firepower, or call it what you will. The will that isn't necessarily there and becomes harder and harder when you're talking about an alliance or coalition context is that of the political will to get things done. So, as an example, legal empowerment within an alliance or coalition framework is hard. The ability to share information within or across an alliance, but particularly beyond alliance boundaries, is really difficult. So actually, the military tasks that could be framed around the challenges that we have identified today are not at the higher end of military challenges to solve. There are some tricky ones in there, to be fair, but they're not typically at the higher end. It is this business of how do we harness political will to this in order that we can move forward. It's an open question. I'll leave it for others to perhaps comment on, but it is one of the great conundrums of our time, I'm afraid, in advancing security challenges at the pace at which we can think about them and identify them.
Thank you. May I ask those who'd like to respond to please unmute themselves and also show their camera.
That identifies the scale of the problem.
Right. Okay. I see. Alessia, I see your hand going up. You can. Can you put your camera out? There you are. Okay. Good.
No, I think the Admiral touched on a very important point. It depends very much on. I think there's two elements to the answer to this question, which is absolutely true. One is where one is aiming at making a difference, because I would imagine that if we're talking about improving the tactical or operational capacity to address a particular issue, that is probably perhaps easier with dedicated and tailored agreements in terms of better information sharing than a broader sort of umbrella, political umbrella, because that would require a convergence of political will, which I agree with you is one of the key issues. And that's one of the elements. So thinking about what it is exactly that we are trying to achieve with particular enhanced information sharing capacity. It's a laborious, slow-paced type of process, but I think that bottom-up that comes from real sort of necessity might help overcoming broader political resistance to this wide canvas type of agreement. And that's one. And two, the truth is also that the legal dimension, which is not too often mentioned, but for example, I was very pleased that in the new integrated operating concept was mentioned by the CDS here in the UK about the problem of lawfare. Because it's not just about us getting our information together to achieve a particular effect. It's also about how others exploit lack of and ambiguity in the legal framework that we use. So I think your question has these two dimensions that are very important, and one demands on us an acting, sort of a shaping function. How do we shape the environment to elicit a success? Well, clarity and specificity in what we demand, I think, is the way to go. The other one is that we need to start thinking about the fact that if we don't take actions, others would exploit it. We've got plenty of examples that come from the outside. So that is perhaps the other way to remove some of the political inertia, as it were. Over.
Thank you very much. Did anyone else want to join into that on that issue? Cronus.
Yes, so thank you. Well, it's a great question, and to build on what both the Admiral said and Alessio, to provide some context, when we're looking at cybersecurity specifically, we have seen that over the last years, there has been an effort to try and regulate cybersecurity on the UN Security Council level. And we are seeing also that we are trying to create norms regarding cybersecurity and cyber warfare and what is considered as legitimate and what not. And we are seeing strong resistance from specific states in order to try and regulate that, because it is a new capability that can be used for offensive purposes, but also for defensive purposes. Countries are building up on that. But because of the intangible nature of cyber and because of the problem of attribution, then the political gain in trying to regulate what is allowed and what is not in the cyber warfare realm, I think is a very apt example in this discussion.
Yes, indeed. This attribution issue is a real stickler. There's an interesting parallel to Alessio's point about lawfare. One thing we've noticed over the last several years is the increasing use of notice to mariners, exercise warning areas, which are intended apparently to have a chilling effect on commercial shipping or military shipping. Of course, ships are completely free to go through them, but it's designed to create a little uncertainty in throwing out overbroad warning areas or exercise areas. We're seeing this increasingly over the last few years. May I throw out a second question, which is a number of speakers have implied that militaries, navies, are going to have to do new things or more of old things in this new in this world of these new challenges, particularly to do with climate change. It was, I think, Photios who implied the military as first responders. How will we strike the balance between investing in cutting-edge, high-end warfighting military capabilities and the military capabilities to do mass evacuations and combat the implications of climate change, unless they are the same thing? But what do people think about how this new economic and political environment, weather environment, might change what navies might look like in the future? Alessio, please, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't mean to monopolize the conversation, but I think in some respects, navies are already taking that on stock. I mean, if you see the design of modern, particularly sort of, you see the differences in smaller classes, like frigates, like corvettes. There is a lot more space that is dedicated to the occasional need to evacuate nationals or to provide support in a disaster relief activity. So navies are already taking place, but I'll try to sort of step out of my natural tendency to behave like a Victorian child and nod and be positive about things, and being a bit more sort of raising the opposite point. I don't think that evacuations or support in disasters are necessarily a primary military maritime function. It certainly was the case over the past few years, because we lacked the opportunity to use other means. And for example, the Italian Navy work in the central Mediterranean in the early stages of the migrant crisis in the mid-2010 is an example of how navies can cope very well and provide absolutely invaluable assets for border control and rescue of people stranded at sea. But at the same time, I think the more important question is what it is that we're trying to address in a crisis. Are we trying to rescue people? Are we trying to enhance sort of border control activity? Are we trying to sort of prevent death at sea? Not all answers to these questions demand navies or maritime forces. That's the first point. The second point, there is a great variety of maritime organizations with different responsibilities in the Mediterranean region. Navies, coast guards in some places have very different jobs. In other places, navies are coast guards. In others, coast guards are like navies. So I think the answer to your question cannot be one size fits all. Second, you also need to sort of be careful about overextending tasks and jobs that might not be a natural fit for navies in particular, and might in fact draw some of their resources away. So all from here. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much. Pierluigi, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I totally agree with Alessio, meaning that we have two dimensions to consider. On the one hand, we would say that navies and more in general armed forces already possess capabilities to intervene in such kind of situations. I can make the example of the Italian armed forces. I just think about when the Italian aircraft carrier Cavour intervened during the earthquake in Haiti. I think it was in 2010. We in Italy, we have also the armed forces that act on a regular basis in case of natural disasters, not just the Navy, but all the armed forces, the Army in particular. And so in general, we could say that the armed forces, navies and armed forces in general are already capable of operating in such scenarios, especially for in the case of navies, for bigger platforms, which are nowadays multi-role platforms and can carry out a wide range of operational tasks, including this kind of operations. On the other hand, again, I agree with Alessio, it's not or will not be the first one task for military vessels, for military assets to carry out. It is already a kind of emergency operation, a kind of task they already perform. Will be again will get increasing importance maybe over the next years due to climate change and all the issues related to climate change and extreme weather events. So on the one hand, the armed forces already possess maybe some sort of capabilities in this sense. We maybe need more coordination, but they should focus or should keep focusing on armed security, military capabilities, developing this sort of capabilities, and the possibility to intervene in these emergency scenarios will come as well somehow. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierluigi. Cronus.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for a great question. I mean, this has been a discussion that has been ongoing, drawing back from my military years for quite a while now. And I would like to draw on my personal experience. One of the last missions that I participated in the Navy was actually during the migrant crisis at the GNC. And one of the things which I think is very important to touch upon here, and it's also very relevant to the climate change discussion that we are having, or climate crisis, as we should be talking about it right now, is that we, as navies, we don't know what we don't know. So participating in these missions, we need support. We need the help of other agencies who are responsible of dealing with that, like the Coast Guard, for example, or ministries of environmental protection, in order to work with them and understand what our role is, what our responsibilities are, and what we are allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. So I think the interagency cooperation and collaboration is crucial when we are trying to introduce new operations and new areas of responsibilities to our Navy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been everything that's been said. It's interesting as we look around NATO's navies at what nations are procuring and how they are embarking on their own capability pathways. There's always a risk, not necessarily of complete divergence, but certainly incoherence. And I think this is why the NATO warfighting capstone concept is so important, because nations procure equipment for a lot of different reasons. Here in the UK, as an example, the Royal Navy, no question, benefits from a national shipbuilding strategy, which is about preserving an industrial base for shipbuilding. And there are obviously defence industrial bases in every nation that serve the national interest and the national economies to a greater or lesser degree. And therefore, there is always this risk of incoherence. And I think the NATO defence planning process and its linkages with the NATO warfighting capstone concept are so important as we go forward to make sure that nations coalesce around key capability themes such that in the future we can move actually beyond interoperability to interchangeability, which is interoperability on steroids, if you will. It's not just a nod to technological alignment and capability alignment. It's about how you can use one force to do an identical job of another. And it is about alliancing, it is about collective political will, it's about a lot of the things that I've drawn attention to previously. But this coherence is so important. And one of the things that we here in Marcom are doing, are championing a new exercise called Dynamic Messenger, which will be all about unmanned systems in the maritime environment, which will have a very large base of national industry involvement in order that we can showcase, but also start to really think about how we draw together common doctrine, common thinking, common training to underpin that type of coherence that I've spoken of.
Thank you, Errol. And Podios, I saw your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Jim. I would like also to echo actually the views of my colleagues, my participants regarding the issue of the role of the Navy. I think which have been quite capable to address this kind of threats. But ultimately, I think what's also important to mention here is that the striking feature, I would say, of climate crisis, environmental security, is the existence of two different agendas here. We have the scientific agenda and the political agenda. And the truth is that the scientific agenda is embedded in the natural sciences and non-governmental activity, and of course carried out by scientists and research institutions. And it offers a list of the problems which obstruct, I would say, our civilization. But the other, of course, key here is the political agenda. The political agenda is a governmental and intergovernmental one, influenced also by public or media debates. But the political agenda is about the awareness by states and public of the issues on the scientific agenda, but above all, the acceptance of political responsibility for dealing with these issues. So what I'm trying to say here is actually, what is important here is the political management of this kind of issues. As long as we can address problems of international cooperation and institutionalization, as long as we are effective with the implementation of unilateral national initiatives, as long as we are clear with the distribution of cost and benefits, but also we should also be aware about the issue of the free rider dilemmas of some countries, as well as with the problem of enforcement. I think if we can address this kind of questions, which of course derive, and it is the responsibility of the political elite, we will be able, I think, to address and be ready to address the challenges that we will face, threats and risks we will face.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Podios. Let me turn to a question. Our time is nearing the end. Let me turn to a question that we were asked from the viewing public. And it deals with the relationship with Africa, particularly, I think in the context of this, with North Africa. The question was, do you think that the EU, in the next EU-AU summit, would strengthen its alliance to ensure maritime security and stability? Maybe the creation of an EU-AU maritime security community would make it easier to have cooperation with Africa. These questions, of course, they raise a very important point, which is, Africa is an essential partner in many of the issues we've discussed. Of course, from the Mediterranean point of view, initially North Africa. But might I ask particularly the academics what their thoughts are on how we, EU and NATO, might improve their relationship with Africa in combating some of these challenges? Alyssa, go ahead.
So there is obviously there has been the so-called La Valletta process and the emergency fund of the European Union for Africa, These are frameworks with significant funding behind that I think have started to make a very clear point about how the European Union sees the relationship with Africa, and it sees it as an important, indeed, a critical relationship. You are absolutely correct in highlighting that. And I think that as we move forward, particularly in light of COVID, particularly how in this respect the European Union has lost some of its normative power over the last year or so, I think we will probably see more of that coming across, and certainly Africa will be prioritized because of its vicinity and because of the, as I say, the political and economic process already ongoing. I think what is interesting is also that the European Union way of presenting activities conducted has also clear ramification with Mediterranean security. And the sort of political and social stability in North Africa and in the broader African continent, and how it impacts the stability of the Mediterranean. So my impression is that the initiatives, including Operation Irene, that have been taking place indicate that there is an understanding within the European Union of the importance of Africa. There is also an intention, political and economic, to make something out of it. And as a result of that, I'm actually looking forward how, in light of COVID, this process sort of will either enhanced and taken forward with even greater interest than before, or indeed slow down. That's really what one should be looking forward, because the next few months will be very indicative of how serious the European Union is about enhancing its relationship with Africa, specifically to increase the stability, political and social, of the continent and its sort of ability to have a stronger and more stable dialogue across the Mediterranean. Over.
Thank you, Alessio. And Pierluigi.
Oh, yeah, thank you. This is very interesting question because, in my opinion, it touches on the future of Europe, and not only of Europe. I want just to make an observation. Of course, it's important to deal with North African countries for obvious reason, and this is true for the European Union and for NATO as well. But in my opinion, it's important to think of the entire African continent. So to engage in a structured relation, in a structured partnership with all the African states, in particular the states of sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahelian region. If we think about future dynamics, migration flow, how climate change can affect population and socio-economic dynamics, demographic dynamics in the region, illicit trafficking, also the proliferation of jihadist groups in the Sahel. We can just think that Nigeria is forecast to have by mid-century the same population of the entire European Union. So we need to come up with a structural strategy to engage with the entire African continent on the base of an equal relationship between the entire European Union and also NATO and the entire African continent, all the African states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, folks, we're drawing near the end. So I would now ask you, as by way of wrap up, and we'll see if our technology can support it. If everyone would now turn on their cameras so that the audience can see us all.
Bandwidth demand.
Bandwidth demand. The system can handle 5 minutes.
Yeah, they can.
So this is going to be a little bit like if you remember it, the old McLaughlin report on PBS in the United States. Everyone has about a minute to sum up their thoughts with final closing, very short final closing thoughts. Alessio, let's start with you.
I'll be very brief. I think moving forward, thinking about the agenda for a new agenda for maritime security, we need to start focusing on what is the place of the Mediterranean international relations, and how can we move forward operationally the problem and the question of interchangeability, not just pure interoperability, whether it is information sharing, whether it is about the ability to sort of share capabilities across a wider spectrum of mission. These, to me, are the two issues that should be at center stage in debates on maritime security in the Mediterranean and indeed in Europe as we move forward. Over from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Cronus.
Thank you, Jim. Well, since the topic of this discussion is new dimensions in maritime security, I would say that the main thing we have to do is to understand what the new risks are to our maritime security, either regional or global. And after we understand that, we should look at who are the relevant parties that we should work together, who have the body of knowledge required, but also the skills and the experience to come and join us so we can tackle these threats and continue to maintain safety of navigation and safety of life at sea.
Thank you. Luigi, final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. And just two things. First of all, we need to join together all the issues we discussed today and to put together all the future security dynamics, security threats and dimension in the Mediterranean. We cannot just consider one dynamic isolated from the others, but we have to put all together in one big picture, let's say. And the other is that we need to raise political awareness about all these topics, because in the end, as it was said before, the answer is up to politics and not to the military issues or other issues, but the answer is up to politics. Thank you.
Thank you. Podios.
Well, the best way to create the future is to make it, right? To predict the future is to create it. In my opinion, I agree with Pierluigi. You need, first of all, to raise political awareness. Once you raise political awareness, of course, you tend to you move to the next step, which is actually to educate and, of course, and train. That is important. Of course, that means that we should have agility of thinking, first of all. And after that, following that, I think repeated interaction, cooperation, and common protocol and practices, in the arena of the maritime security should facilitate communities to take effective action across all these issues we discuss in the long run. And that can be, of course, a key to addressing successfully these threats.
Thank you. Yeah. Finally,
well, thank you. It's great to be among friends and colleagues, and thank you to Jim and the team here for putting this together. I really did have the easy task of turning up and just saying a few words, but unsurprisingly, I agree with what has been said. I would repeat the fact that within NATO there is some good news. I would argue that the NATO military strategy, the DDA work and the NWCC work that cascade from it are generational and totemic. I think 2030 and the work surrounding that will continue to evolve and pull that work forward into the future domain. And this is where academic interest, academic involvement, I think will be essential to make sure that we do create the right future, as Photios has said. And I think the other point is just the fact that whether we look at technology or whether we look at climate change, they both contribute to an increasingly globalized world. And therefore, to a greater extent than before, I think looking at problems within boundaries on charts and maps is becoming increasingly unhelpful. And we must think about the collateral consequences and influences from beyond any traditional borders and boundaries in the way that they affect us in Europe and indeed, of course, in the Mediterranean. Very important point that has been made by others. But no, thank you very much indeed, Jim.
Thank you. Well, I think that just about brings us to a close. It finally remains for me to do two things. The first is to remind everyone of the main Shade Med conference for 2021, which will be held on 7 and 8 October in Rome. And it's with an impressive program. So I recommend people do get online, look at the EU NAV4 Med website and discover what's there. I would strongly recommend it. Secondly, it finally falls to me to thank all of our speakers, Alessio, Cronus, Pierluigi, Photios, to thank Admiral Agostini, the EU NAV4 Med team, our own Maritime IT people who worked hard to put this on, Admiral, for your time, sir, and the whole staff for everything that they've done. It's been a great pleasure to work with EU NAV4 Med on this project. We really look forward to co-hosting the main conference with them in October. And I think, sir, that's about it from us. Brilliant. So I think this will be Marcom signing out. Good.
Ciao.